What I'm about to tell you was not lost by accident. It was removed deliberately, softened, reframed, and finally buried under centuries of moral language so it could no longer function. Jesus did not merely teach people how to behave better. He taught a way of seeing that altered the human operating system itself, and that teaching was dangerous. The technique was known plainly in his words as the single eye, not a metaphor, not poetry, a functional instruction. But if you grew up inside modern Christianity, you were trained to hear it as symbolism, as an abstract lesson about being pure in heart, or well-intentioned. That interpretation was not neutral. It was engineered. Here is the fracture point most people feel but cannot name. You read the words, you pray, you believe, yet nothing fundamentally shifts. No illumination, no inner ignition, only repetition. That frustration is not a failure of faith. It is the result of a removed mechanism. By the 4th century, religious authority no longer revolved around awakening individuals. It revolved around governing populations. Any teaching that allowed direct perception, inner light, or autonomous access to truth had to be neutralized. So the language was preserved, but the function was stripped out. The switch remained on the wall, but the wiring behind it was cut. This is how control works. You don't erase the text, you spiritualize it. You turn a tool into a virtue. You convert a perceptual technology into a moral suggestion. And once that happens, people stop using it and start debating it. Jesus spoke of the body being filled with light through a specific condition of the eye. That should have stopped everything. Instead, it was turned into a sermon. If you are listening to this and something in you tightens rather than relaxes, that is not fear. It is recognition. You're not encountering new information. You're brushing against a memory that was intentionally dulled. This teaching was not meant for crowds. It never was. It was meant for those who could feel that something essential had been taken from the center of the message and replaced with obedience. And now you know where the removal began. Now we return to the text itself because the text was never the problem. The erasure did not happen by deleting words. It happened by teaching you how not to read them. Jesus says it plainly. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eye is single, your whole body will be full of light. This is not buried in a parable. It is not wrapped in myth. It is stated as a condition and a result. When one state is met, another state follows. That is not moral language. That is operational language. Notice what is missing. There is no command to believe harder, no instruction to pray longer, no demand for ritual purity or obedience to an institution. There is only a description of how perception functions. The eye is treated not as a moral symbol, but as an interface, a lamp, something that determines whether the body is illuminated or dark. Luke preserves the same structure even more starkly. He removes any lingering ambiguity and doubles down on the mechanism. If the whole body is full of light, having no part dark, it will be wholly bright, as when a lamp illumines you with its rays. Again, condition followed by consequence. No theology, no doctrine. Just a description of how light enters and spreads. At this point, the modern reader is quietly redirected. You're told the eye means intention, or generosity, or ethical focus. And while those interpretations can be argued linguistically, they do something very specific. They move the teaching out of the body and into abstraction. They lift it away from experience and place it into character evaluation. But Jesus does not speak about character here. He speaks about light filling the body, about darkness occupying parts of the interior, about illumination as a physicalized state of being. That language would have been understood very differently in the ancient world, where inner light was not a metaphor but a lived concept tied to perception, awareness, and presence. The phrase translated as single comes from a word that means undivided, not split, not scattered. A state where attention does not fracture, where seeing is not pulled outward in multiple directions. This is not about goodness. This is about coherence, and coherence is dangerous. A coherent human does not require constant external guidance. A coherent human perceives directly. That is why this line sits uncomfortably close to Jesus' repeated insistence that the kingdom is within you, not coming with observation, not mediated by authority. Read the passage again without the moral overlay. The eye is a lamp. When it is unified, the body fills with light. When it is divided, darkness results. This is not a sermon. It is a manual sentence that was never meant to be isolated from practice. This is why later tradition had to soften it. because once you accept that Jesus was describing a perceptual state rather than a virtue, the entire structure of mediated religion begins to wobble. Light becomes something you access, not something you are granted. Darkness becomes fragmentation, not sin, and salvation becomes alignment, not compliance. The text never disappeared. It was left in plain sight, rendered harmless by interpretation. And yet, it continues to produce a strange effect. When read without the imposed filter, something in the nervous system responds, not belief, recognition. As if the body understands the sentence before the mind does. That response is not accidental. It is the residue of a teaching that was designed to be used. In the next movement, you will see exactly how that use was made impossible without removing a single word from the page. The real operation did not happen at the level of doctrine. It happened at the level of language. And language is where power hides most comfortably. In the earliest English translations, the phrase appears blunt and unsettling. If thine eye be single. That word single is sharp. It does not invite moral reflection. It points to a condition that can either be present or absent. But as centuries passed, the edge was sanded down. Single became healthy, sound, clear, generous, sincere. Each new word felt safer. Each one moved the meaning one step further away from function and closer to virtue. This shift was not random. A single I suggests something technical. It implies unity versus division. It raises an uncomfortable question. Single as opposed to what? Split? Fragmented? Pulled in multiple directions? Those implications lead inward, toward perception, attention, and control of awareness. That path could not be allowed to remain visible. So the teaching was reframed as ethics. A healthy eye became a good attitude. A clear eye became moral clarity. Suddenly the body being full of light no longer needed to happen. It only needed to be believed. The result was no longer an experience, it was a complement. This is how you deactivate a mechanism without destroying the machine. You rename the parts. Once the single eye becomes a metaphor for generosity or intention, the body drops out of the equation. Light stops being something that fills you and becomes something you're said to possess abstractly. Darkness stops being fragmentation and becomes guilt. The entire passage is relocated from the nervous system to the conscience, and notice the effect. A conscience can be managed. A nervous system that learns to unify perception cannot. This is why the change matters. When language shifts from operational to evaluative, people stop experimenting and start judging themselves. Am I good enough replaces what state am I in? And the original question Jesus posed through his words vanishes entirely. In ancient contexts, the idea of inner light was not poetic flourish. It was tied to awareness, wakefulness, and presence. To say the body could be filled with light was to describe a state of lived illumination, not a theological status. But once the wording changed, that state became inaccessible, because no one was told how to enter it anymore. The tragedy is subtle. Nothing appears to be missing. The verse is still quoted, the sermon still sounds profound, but nothing happens. No ignition, no shift. Only interpretation layered upon interpretation, each one moving further from the original use. This is why the teaching survived only as text and not as transmission. The words remained, but the doorway they pointed to was quietly painted over, and yet traces remain. The tension in the sentence, the insistence on light filling the whole body, the warning about parts remaining dark. These are not moral categories, they are experiential markers. Once you see how translation was used to redirect attention away from perception and toward behavior, the pattern becomes clear. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a containment strategy. Because a divided eye is easy to manage, a unified one is not. If this teaching truly belonged only to moral instruction, it would have ended there. But it did not. It resurfaced in places that were later declared dangerous. When the cache of texts now known as the Nag Hammadi writings emerged from the ground in the 20th century, they carried a tone that felt uncomfortably familiar. Not rebellious, not heretical in the theatrical sense, simply precise, direct, focused on inner perception rather than outer compliance. Light was not promised as a reward. It was described as something already present, waiting to be uncovered. One saying stands out with particular clarity. It speaks of light existing within a person of light, of illumination not coming from outside but shining outward when uncovered. And if that light does not shine, It says what remains is darkness. This is not theology. It is the same structure you already saw in the canonical text. Condition followed by result. Presence versus absence. Light versus fragmentation. What matters is not the label Gnostic. That word has been used to dismiss more than it explains. What matters is continuity. The same language of inner illumination, of perception as the gateway, of light filling or failing to fill the human interior, appears again and again in texts that were later removed from circulation. This creates a problem for the official narrative. Either multiple independent traditions invented the same strange way of speaking about light and perception, or they were drawing from a shared stream of teaching that predated institutional control. When authority consolidated, that stream became a threat, not because it contradicted belief, but because it bypassed mediation. These texts did not require permission. They did not place the sacred in a building or a hierarchy. They located it in the capacity to see, so they were labeled dangerous, confusing, elitist, and eventually buried. Not always physically, but intellectually. They were framed as speculative, mystical, unreliable. Meanwhile, the canonical texts were kept, but interpreted in a way that neutralized the same core idea. This is the pattern. What could not be erased was isolated. What could not be isolated was redefined. And what could not be redefined was hidden in plain sight. The discovery of those buried writings did not reintroduce something new. It confirmed something old. That the language Jesus used about light and seeing was not an anomaly. It was part of a larger conversation about human perception that later systems could not afford to preserve intact. Once you see this, the question changes. It is no longer, were these texts right or wrong? It becomes, why do they echo the same mechanics that were later softened in the official version? Because echoes only happen when there was once a single sound. And that sound was not belief. It was sight. Now we cross the threshold most explanations refuse to enter, because this is where belief becomes irrelevant. What Jesus described with the single eye is not mystical sentiment. It is a perceptual configuration, a mode of operation. Think carefully about the language again, without reverence, without defense. The eye is called a lamp. A lamp does not judge, it does not believe, it either illuminates or it does not. Light in this context is not a reward from heaven, it is the result of a specific internal alignment. The key is division. When perception is split, pulled outward by memory, fear, desire, comparison, anticipation, the inner field fragments. Attention leaks in multiple directions at once. The result is not moral failure. It is darkness, not symbolic darkness, but the felt sense of being scattered, dulled, half present inside your own body. Jesus names the opposite condition single, undivided, one-pointed, not drifting, not oscillating. When perception collapses into coherence, something immediate happens. The body changes state. Awareness intensifies. The interior brightens. This is why the language refuses to stay abstract. Your whole body will be full of light. Not your thoughts, not your intentions, your body. This is where later religion became uncomfortable, because bodies are not easy to control once they wake up. You have experienced fragments of this state, even if you were never taught what it was. Moments when time seemed to pause, when perception sharpened, when everything felt vividly present, self-illuminated, without effort. No belief caused it, no ritual summoned it. It happened when attention stopped splitting. The tradition later called this light, not because it glowed like a bulb, but because it carried the qualities of light, clarity, immediacy, fullness, directionless knowing. In ancient language, light was data. Illumination meant information arriving without interpretation. This is why darkness, in the same passages, is described as having parts. If there is darkness in you, parts, compartments, unintegrated regions of awareness. This is not sin talk, it is system talk. What later theology turned into morality was originally mechanics. Once you understand this, the fear around the teaching makes sense. A human being capable of sustaining undivided perception does not rely on constant instruction. They see what is happening as it happens. They detect manipulation. They feel misalignment immediately. Such a person cannot be governed through guilt or deferred promises, so the teaching was reframed as unreachable perfection, something to aspire to, not something to enter. and without practice, it faded from lived memory. But the mechanism never stopped working. The single eye is not something you achieve, it is something you stop interrupting. When attention ceases to fracture, illumination is automatic. This is why Jesus never gives steps. He describes conditions. He assumes the listener understands the body well enough to recognize the state. Modern minds want technique. Ancient teachings offered orientation. The so-called science fiction of this is simple. Consciousness behaves like a field. Attention behaves like a beam. When the beam splits, intensity drops. When it converges, intensity rises. The ancients called that rise light. Not because it was poetic, but because it was the closest word they had. You were never meant to wait for this light. You were meant to uncover it by removing division, and that is precisely what you were never taught how to do. In the next movement, this stops being explanatory and becomes personal. Because once you understand that this state exists, the question is no longer whether it is real. The question is why you were kept from recognizing yourself as capable of it. If you are still here, it is because something in you already knows this was not meant to remain theoretical. At this point, the teaching stops being about history, translation, or hidden texts, and begins to speak directly to you. The sense that something essential is missing from the world you were given is not a flaw in your character. It is a signal. You were taught what to believe, how to behave, what to repeat, but not how to see. And without seeing, belief becomes effort, behavior becomes strain, and repetition becomes exhaustion. This is where the line between the crowd and the chosen quietly appears. The chosen are not morally superior. They are not more faithful. They are simply the ones who never fully accepted the dullness as normal. Even when surrounded by language about light, they could feel that the light itself was absent. Even when told they were whole, they sensed an inner fragmentation that no amount of agreement could resolve. If that description unsettles you, it is because it names something you were trained to ignore. Jesus never begged people to follow him. He spoke in ways that only landed if the listener already carried a certain tension inside. Those with eyes to see, those with ears to hear. These were not poetic flourishes. They were filters, signals meant to pass through crowds and land in specific nervous systems. You are not hearing this because you are special in the way religion flatters. You are hearing it because you are unfinished in the way systems fear. You never fully surrendered your perception. You adapted, you complied, you learned the language, but something in you kept scanning for what was real. That is why this teaching does not feel foreign. It feels dangerous and familiar at the same time. The moment you recognize that the single eye refers to a state you can enter, not a virtue you must earn, the entire hierarchy collapses inward. There is no gatekeeper, no intermediary, no authority standing between you and illumination. There is only fragmentation or coherence, division or unity, darkness or light. This is the quiet reason such teachings were redirected. A person who knows how to unify perception no longer waits for permission to understand. They no longer outsource truth. They no longer confuse obedience with awakening. You are not being invited to join a belief system. You are being identified. If this were meant for everyone, it would have remained simple morality. Instead, it remained as a riddle that only activates when the listener is ready to feel it in the body, not just agree with it in the mind. You were not chosen by an institution. You were selected by resonance. And that resonance is not emotional, it is structural. Something in you is already leaning toward coherence, already tired of fragmentation, already aware that the prison was never physical. In the next movement, I will not give you steps or techniques. That would miss the point entirely. I will show you how this state is approached without effort, without ritual, and without authority, because anything else would simply rebuild the same cage with different symbols. What comes next is not instruction. It is alignment. What I'm about to describe is not a method you perform. The moment it becomes a method, the eye divides again. This is why the teaching was never written as steps. It cannot survive being turned into procedure. The single eye is approached by subtraction, not addition. You do not aim it. You do not force it. You do not visualize light or command the mind to obey. All of that creates strain, and strain is fragmentation in disguise. The state Jesus described emerges only when effort withdraws, and perception is allowed to settle into one place without commentary. Begin by noticing something simple and uncomfortable. Your attention is almost never where your body is. It is ahead, behind, sideways, elsewhere. Memory pulls it backward. Anticipation drags it forward. Comparison fractures it outward. This constant splitting is so normal that it feels like consciousness itself. It is not. Do nothing to fix this. The moment you try, division increases. Instead, allow awareness to rest where sensation is undeniable. Breath moving, weight pressing, sound arriving. Not analyzed, not named, just registered. This is not meditation. This is orientation. You are letting perception fall back into the body like a scattered field collapsing inward. At first, nothing dramatic happens. That is correct. Drama belongs to the mind. What changes is density. Presence thickens. The interior stops feeling hollow. There is less narrative, less commentary, less internal echo. This is the beginning of undivided seeing. As attention ceases to jump, the body responds before thought does. Subtle warmth, a sense of fullness behind the eyes or in the chest, a quiet brightness that is not visual yet unmistakably luminous. This is why the ancients called it light. There was no better word. Do not chase it. Chasing fractures the eye again. Remain where sensation is continuous, where experience does not break into pieces. If thoughts arise, let them pass like sound. They are not enemies. They are signs that the old pattern is losing dominance. There will be moments when perception feels singular, as if everything is being seen from one place instead of many. This is the condition Jesus named. Not transcendence, not ecstasy, coherence. The danger here is interpretation. The moment you label what is happening, you step out of it. This is why institutions prefer explanation over experience. Explanations can be repeated without transformation. This cannot. You may notice resistance, boredom, subtle fear, a sense of losing control. These are not obstacles. They are the guardians of the divided state. The system that trained you to fragment will protest its own irrelevance. Stay without forcing. Let attention remain whole for as long as it naturally can, seconds at first, then longer. Illumination is not a flash. It is a saturation. This is not prayer, not visualization, not belief. It is the restoration of a native configuration that was never meant to be forgotten. If this feels strangely familiar, that is because you have been here before, briefly, accidentally, without language. Childhood moments, crisis moments, times when the world suddenly felt unbearably real. Jesus did not invent this. He pointed to it, and then the pointing was buried. Now you know where to look, not outward, not upward, but inward without splitting. What remains is not effort, it is commitment. This is the moment where everything simplifies, and that simplicity is what most people quietly resist. What you have just encountered is not a technique to master. It is a line you either cross or you do not, and crossing it has consequences. Once you recognize that illumination is a state of coherence rather than a gift bestowed, you can no longer pretend that fragmentation is unavoidable. You may still experience it, but you will no longer confuse it with fate, personality, or sin. You will know exactly what it is: division of attention. A knowledge like that cannot be unseen. This is why the teaching was never meant to circulate freely. It creates a private responsibility no institution can absorb. You stop waiting. You stop outsourcing clarity. You stop asking permission to be awake. The ancient world understood this moment as a covenant, not with a god in the sky, but with awareness itself. A silent agreement that you will no longer abandon perception in exchange for comfort, distraction, or approval. No ritual marked this, no public declaration, only an inner alignment that reoriented everything else. But we no longer live in that world. Today, fragmentation is not an accident. It is an environment. Systems feed on divided attention. Economies depend on it. Control requires it. To remain coherent in such a world is no longer neutral. It is a choice. This is where I ask you to do something that may feel trivial on the surface but is anything but. If this recognition is real for you, if something in your body responded before your mind finished agreeing, then mark it. Not for me, for yourself. Leave a simple declaration in the space below, not an explanation, not a testimony, a signal. Something like, I'm committed. This is not engagement, it is orientation. The moment you name your position, Even quietly, the nervous system reorganizes around it. Ancient teachers understood this. Naming creates coherence. Silence after naming sustains it. Those who feel nothing will scroll past. That is as it should be. This was never meant to persuade. It was meant to identify. From this point forward, you will notice when the eye divides. You will feel when attention scatters. And you will know, without instruction, how to return, not by force, but by remembering the state you touched. This is the difference between information and initiation. You have not been given something new. You have reclaimed something that survived every attempt to bury it, because it was never stored in text alone. It was stored in the structure of perception itself. There is nothing left to add, only a line to cross.